1. Salvation outside Catholicism. The first contradiction concerns the doctrine known as extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the Church, there is no salvation. Historically, this was defined in absolute and uncompromising terms. In 1302, Pope Boniface VIII issued the bull Unam Sanctam, declaring that it was absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. This made subjection to the papacy itself a requirement for eternal life. The Council of Florence reinforced this in 1442 through Cantate Domino, which explicitly excluded not only pagans but also Jews, heretics, and schismatics from salvation. The decree emphasized that even martyrdom could not save someone unless they remained within the Catholic Church. In short, membership in the visible Catholic institution was presented as an absolute condition for entering heaven. By the mid-20th century, however, Vatican II shifted the official stance. Lumen Gentium, 1964, acknowledged that salvation was possible for non-Catholics, including Muslims, Jews, even those who, through no fault of their own, did not know Christ, but sincerely sought God through conscience and good deeds. Nostra Aetate further emphasized respect for non-Christian religions. Modern Catholic leaders, including Pope Francis, have canonized non-Catholic martyrs, such as Coptic Orthodox Christians, as saints. Prominent apologists, like Bishop Robert Barron, have argued that even atheists of goodwill may be saved by grace outside explicit Catholic membership. To reconcile this, Catholic theology often appeals to the concept of invincible ignorance, the idea that those unaware of the Catholic faith, through no fault of their own, may still receive salvation. Critics, however, point out that the text of Cantate Domino leaves no room for such exceptions. Thus, the traditional absolute exclusion contrasts sharply with the modern inclusive interpretation, forming one of the clearest examples of doctrinal reversal in Catholic history. 2. Popes versus councils. The second contradiction centers on the question of ultimate authority in the Catholic Church. Does it rest with an ecumenical council or with the Pope himself? The issue emerged most dramatically during the Great Western Schism of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, when rival popes claimed legitimacy. In 1415, the Council of Constance issued the decree Haec Sancta, declaring that a general council has power immediately from Christ and that everyone, including the Pope, must obey it in matters of faith and reform. This principle, known as conciliarism, was rooted in the belief that the Church as a whole, represented in council, could not err, and thus had authority even over the papacy. The council also exercised this power directly by deposing rival popes and electing Martin V, establishing its claim to supremacy in practice as well as theory. Centuries later, the First Vatican Council, 1870, defined papal supremacy and infallibility in Pastor Aeternus. It declared that the Roman pontiff holds a preeminence of ordinary power over every other church, and that all clergy and faithful owe him hierarchical subordination and true obedience. In this model, ultramontanism, the Pope stands above any council in authority, and the Church is bound to follow his definitions even without conciliar approval. This directly contradicts the principle expressed at Constance, which asserted the reverse. Apologists attempt to harmonize this by claiming Haec Sancta was not dogmatic, or was only a temporary measure to solve the schism. Critics counter that the legitimacy of Martin V, and by extension all subsequent popes, depends on recognizing the council's authority. If Constance lacked the power it claimed, then Martin's election would be invalid. Yet if its authority is accepted, it conflicts with Vatican I's definition of papal supremacy. This unresolved paradox highlights one of the most fundamental tensions in Catholic history: whether the Church is governed by collective conciliar authority or by the unilateral supremacy of the Pope. 3. Icon veneration. The third contradiction concerns the practice of venerating icons and religious images. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 declared the making and honoring of sacred images to be part of the unbroken apostolic tradition. The Council stated, "We keep unchanged all the ecclesiastical traditions handed down to us, whether in writing or verbally, one of which is the making of pictorial representations." Those who rejected the legitimacy of icons were anathematized. According to Nicaea II, icon veneration was not an innovation, but a tradition received directly from the apostles, preserved through the early Church without interruption. This council is regarded as ecumenical, giving its decrees high authority. However, later Catholic thinkers introduced a different understanding. In the 19th century, John Henry Newman, one of the most influential theologians in modern Catholicism, argued that many Catholic practices, including icon veneration, incense, candles, and holy water, were not part of apostolic Christianity, but were later developments adopted from pagan culture. In his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, Newman openly admitted that these practices originated from pagan customs but had been sanctified by being absorbed into the Church. This admission appears to contradict Nicaea II, which had claimed apostolic origins. The tension lies in the basis of justification. The Council of 787 defended icons by asserting continuity with the apostles. Newman defended them by reinterpreting their legitimacy as a natural development shaped by history and culture. By Catholic standards, this is problematic. If Nicaea II was correct, Newman's theory undermines it. If Newman is correct, then Nicaea II's claim of apostolic origin was false. The Catholic Church, however, canonized Newman as a saint and named him a doctor of the Church, effectively endorsing his views. This creates a situation where the Church simultaneously affirms two irreconcilable explanations for the same practice. 4. Protestant baptism. The fourth contradiction involves the question of whether baptism administered outside the Catholic Church possesses any saving power. The Council of Florence, through Cantate Domino in 1442, declared that only to those remaining in the Catholic Church are the sacraments of the Church of benefit for salvation. This statement was absolute. While sacraments outside the Church could technically be performed with correct form and matter, they conveyed no salvific grace if received in a heretical or schismatic community. By this standard, Protestant baptisms were considered valid in form but spiritually useless, since those receiving them remained outside the Church's unity. Vatican II, however, articulated the opposite principle in Unitatis Redintegratio, 1964, its decree on ecumenism. It taught that baptism, when properly administered with water and in the name of the Trinity, truly incorporates a person into Christ and has justifying efficacy even when performed in Protestant communities. This is not presented as an exception for the ignorant, but as a general rule applying to all valid baptisms, regardless of ecclesial affiliation. In this framework, baptism outside Catholicism still unites an individual to the body of Christ, making them in some sense a member of the Church. The conflict lies in the universality of each claim. Florence's position functions as a negative universal. Sacraments outside Catholic communion, as a category, have no saving benefit. Vatican II asserts a positive universal. Baptism, as a category, always justifies and incorporates, even outside Catholicism. Reconciling these requires redefining the scope of Florence's language. But this is problematic since it was presented as definitive. Critics argue that the contradiction undermines the Catholic principle of doctrinal immutability. Either baptism outside the Church is salvific, as Vatican II affirms, or it is not, as Florence declared. Both cannot be true without negating one another. 5. Confession. The fifth contradiction concerns the sacrament of confession, specifically whether its private form was instituted by Christ from the beginning or developed later in history. The Council of Trent, in 1551, defined that sacramental confession to a priest was of apostolic origin. It anathematized anyone who claimed that the Church's practice of private confession was a human invention or had not been observed from the earliest days. In this framework, private confession is directly rooted in Christ's authority when he gave the apostles power to forgive sins, and it is portrayed as an unbroken practice since the apostolic era. The Modern Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in 1992, describes a very different historical narrative. It acknowledges that in the earliest centuries, reconciliation for grave sins took the form of public penance, often a lengthy and humiliating process that could be performed only once in a lifetime. The practice of private and repeatable confession, it explains, developed gradually, with Irish monks and missionaries in the 7th century playing a central role in shaping the form familiar today. This view recognizes confession as a product of historical evolution, not as a practice that was fully established at the Church's beginning. The contradiction lies in the fact that Trent explicitly condemned the claim that private confession arose later as heretical, while the Catechism itself now teaches precisely that. Apologists attempt to resolve the issue by distinguishing between the sacrament's divine institution and its disciplinary form, suggesting that while Christ established the power of absolution, the mode of its administration developed over time. Critics respond that Trent's language explicitly tied the private form to Christ's command and denied it was a human invention. The Catechism's historical account appears to fall directly under Trent's anathema, creating a serious inconsistency in Catholic teaching on one of its most central sacraments. 6. The death penalty. The sixth contradiction addresses the Catholic Church's teaching on capital punishment. Historically, the Church not only permitted but affirmed the moral legitimacy of the death penalty. The Catechism of the Council of Trent, 1566, taught that the state, by executing criminals, was acting in obedience to the commandment against murder because it upheld the security of human life. Executing the guilty was not regarded as murder, but as a just act of authority entrusted by God. Catholic tradition for centuries cited Genesis 9-6 and Romans 13-4 to justify this principle, and church authorities consistently handed over condemned heretics, such as Jan Hus at the Council of Constance, to be executed by civil authorities. In contrast, the modern Catechism of the Catholic Church, revised in 2018 under Pope Francis, declared the death penalty inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. This marked not just a disciplinary adjustment, but a moral judgment, redefining capital punishment as intrinsically opposed to human dignity. The wording emphasized that this inadmissibility applied in principle, not merely in practice due to improved prison systems. By this teaching, the death penalty is wrong in all cases and at all times. The contradiction lies in the Church's stance on intrinsic morality. If something is intrinsically evil, as the 2018 revision suggests, it has always been evil, regardless of context. This implies that for centuries, Catholics were taught to affirm as good what is now declared a grave moral wrong. Apologists argue that the development is circumstantial, applying to modern societies with adequate means of punishment. Critics, however, point out that the new catechism explicitly grounds its prohibition not in circumstances, but in the nature of human dignity itself. Thus, the moral status of capital punishment has shifted from a divinely sanctioned good to an intrinsic violation, raising a direct contradiction in the Church's teaching on life and justice. 7. Worship with non-Catholics. The seventh contradiction concerns Catholic participation in worship with members of other Christian denominations or other religions. For centuries, the Church explicitly forbade such practices. In 1928, Pope Pius XI issued the encyclical Mortalium Animos, which condemned ecumenical gatherings and prohibited Catholics from participating in the prayer assemblies of non-Catholics. The document argued that to join such services was to give approval to false forms of Christianity and to risk undermining the Catholic claim as the one true faith. It presented Catholic worship as exclusive and any form of shared prayer as unlawful and spiritually dangerous. This position was dramatically reversed by the Second Vatican Council in Unitatis Redintegratio, 1964. This decree on ecumenism described common prayer with separated Christians as desirable and effective for fostering unity. Vatican II emphasized dialogue, reconciliation, and collaboration with other Christian groups, marking a decisive shift away from the exclusivity of the pre-conciliar era. In practice, post-Vatican II popes have participated in ecumenical and interfaith services, such as John Paul II's interreligious prayer gathering in Assisi in 1986, which brought together leaders of many faiths to pray for peace. These gestures would have been unthinkable under the directives of Pius XI. Apologists attempt to reconcile the two positions by distinguishing between formal worship, which remains prohibited, and certain forms of common prayer aimed at unity. However, critics argue that this distinction is artificial, since Vatican II and subsequent papal actions explicitly endorse forms of joint prayer previously condemned. The contradiction is clear. What was once described as unlawful and spiritually compromising is now officially promoted as virtuous and fruitful. The shift reflects a broader transformation in the Church's approach to non-Catholics, moving from a defensive fortress mentality to an open model of ecumenical engagement, but at the cost of internal consistency in doctrine and practice. 8. Usury. The eighth contradiction concerns the morality of charging interest on loans. In medieval Catholic teaching, usury was absolutely prohibited. The Second Lateran Council in 1139 condemned that detestable and shameful practice of usury, by which was meant the charging of any interest, however small, on a loan. Those guilty of usury were to be denied Christian burial unless they repented, showing how seriously the Church regarded this sin. The prohibition was repeated in later councils and reaffirmed by theologians such as Thomas Aquinas, who argued that money, being sterile, could not justly generate profit from itself. The Church's stance was absolute. Lending with interest was sinful, regardless of the rate or circumstances. By contrast, in the modern period, the Catholic Church has effectively abandoned this prohibition. Today, interest-bearing loans are universally accepted as a normal and even necessary part of the global economy. Catholic institutions themselves operate with bank accounts, investments, and financial arrangements that depend on interest. The shift in practice reflects a broader societal recognition that money can be productive capital, capable of generating wealth when lent. Modern Catholic teaching rarely, if ever, condemns ordinary lending practices, and the historic ban on usury has been reinterpreted to mean only the charging of excessive or exploitative rates of interest. The contradiction arises because the original prohibition was not framed as a matter of discipline, but as a moral absolute. Councils and theologians insisted that charging any interest was intrinsically unjust. To reconcile this with modern practice, apologists argue that the definition of usury has changed, and that the Church has only ever condemned unjust or excessive lending. Critics, however, note that medieval documents explicitly condemned all interest, not only exploitative rates. By redefining the term, the Church appears to have altered the meaning of a previously absolute teaching, creating a direct discontinuity between its medieval doctrine and modern acceptance of interest-based finance. 9. Communion in both kinds. The ninth contradiction concerns the manner of receiving Holy Communion, whether the faithful must receive under both kinds, bread and wine, or whether reception under one kind is sufficient. Early Church practice and testimony from early popes clearly favored communion in both forms. Pope Gelasius I in the late 5th century denounced the withholding of the chalice from the laity as a great sacrilege. Pope Leo I, in the mid-5th century, likewise criticized practices that denied both kinds, describing them as deviations from the institution of Christ at the Last Supper. These testimonies present communion in both kinds as a direct apostolic tradition that could not be legitimately altered. By contrast, the Council of Constance in 1415 condemned as heretical the teaching that communion in both kinds was necessary for salvation. The council ordered that the laity were to receive only the consecrated bread, reserving the chalice to the clergy. This decision was taken largely in response to the Hussite movement, which demanded communion under both kinds as essential. The council insisted that Christ is received whole and entire under either species, thereby legitimizing the withholding of the chalice from laypeople. The contradiction lies in the Church's self-understanding. Early authorities treated communion in both kinds as essential to preserving apostolic integrity. Later, the medieval Church claimed authority to alter this practice, even anathematizing those who called the withholding of the chalice sacrilegious. This represents a reversal not only in practice, but in theological emphasis. The earlier stance upheld an unchanging tradition, while the later stance asserted papal authority to modify even apostolic customs for pastoral reasons. Apologists argue that both positions can be reconciled under the doctrine of Christ's full presence in each species. Critics counter that the issue is not Christ's presence, but the legitimacy of changing a practice the early Church declared to be sacrosanct. This illustrates a fundamental discontinuity in Catholic sacramental discipline. 10. Political authority. The 10th contradiction concerns the question of whether the Pope holds temporal, political authority over the nations of the world. In the medieval era, papal claims to universal power were explicit. The bull Unam Sanctam, issued by Pope Boniface VIII in 1302, declared that it was necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. It also asserted that both spiritual and temporal swords belong to the Church, with the temporal sword wielded by secular rulers only at the Church's discretion. This document, considered infallible by many Catholic theologians, effectively placed all earthly authority under papal supremacy. Earlier papal documents, such as Dictatus Papae 1075, made similar claims, stating that the Pope could depose emperors and that all princes were subject to his authority. By the 20th century, however, the Catholic Church had dramatically revised its stance. The Second Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes 1965 declared that the Church has no mission in the political order. This statement denied any direct temporal authority for the papacy, framing the Church's mission exclusively in spiritual terms. The practical abandonment of the papal tiara, which symbolized the Pope's threefold authority over heaven, earth, and purgatory, reinforced this shift. Modern popes now explicitly disclaim temporal dominion and emphasize the independence of the Church from political power. The contradiction is evident. Medieval teaching proclaimed universal papal authority over kings and nations, while modern teaching denies any such claim. Apologists argue that the earlier claims were exaggerated or context-specific, but critics note that Unum Sanctam was issued with definitive, binding language. If papal temporal supremacy was once an infallible truth, it cannot later be denied without undermining infallibility itself. The reversal illustrates how Catholic doctrine has shifted according to political circumstances, raising serious questions about consistency in its teaching authority. 11. Universal jurisdiction. The 11th contradiction involves the papacy's claim to universal jurisdiction. At the First Vatican Council in 1870, the Constitution Pastor Aeternus defined that the Pope has supreme and full power of jurisdiction over the whole Church, and that this primacy was known in every age. The Council asserted that Peter and his successors had always exercised universal jurisdiction, and that this was demonstrated by the constant custom of the Church throughout history. This was not presented merely as a theological doctrine, but as an historical fact embedded into dogmatic teaching. However, in 2016, the Joint Catholic Orthodox Commission issued the Chieti document, which acknowledged that in the first millennium, the Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East. Instead, the relationship between Rome and the Eastern Patriarchates was one of honor rather than jurisdictional control. This admission directly undermines Vatican I's assertion of unbroken universal jurisdiction, since it concedes that for centuries the Pope did not exercise the power that was later claimed to be constant and universal. Apologists attempt to reconcile the two positions by suggesting that papal primacy existed in principle but was not always fully exercised, or that the Eastern churches failed to recognize Rome's rightful authority. Critics argue that this explanation is inadequate, because Vatican I did not merely claim a theological principle, but insisted on the historical fact that papal universal jurisdiction was known in every age. The Chieti document proves otherwise. The contradiction, therefore, lies not only in theology, but also in verifiable history. If the dogma of Vatican I rests on a historical claim that is false, its authority as an infallible definition is undermined. This creates a systemic problem. Catholic infallibility appears dependent on a narrative that modern Catholic scholarship itself admits to be inaccurate. 12. Divorce and remarriage. The 12th contradiction concerns the Church's treatment of divorced and remarried individuals with respect to receiving Holy Communion. For centuries, Catholic teaching was explicit. A person who divorces and remarries without an annulment of the first marriage is considered to be in a state of objective grave sin. Because marriage is indissoluble, any subsequent union while the first spouse is still living is regarded as adultery. As a result, such individuals were strictly barred from the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. This position was consistently reaffirmed by councils, popes, and canon law, leaving no ambiguity about the discipline. In 2016, however, Pope Francis issued the apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia. While the document did not explicitly overturn the traditional prohibition, it introduced language that opened the possibility of divorced and remarried Catholics being admitted to communion after a process of pastoral discernment. The text encouraged priests and bishops to accompany individuals in complex situations and discern their personal culpability. In practice, many dioceses and bishops' conferences interpreted this as authorization to allow some remarried Catholics to receive communion. The Pope's refusal to answer the formal questions, dubia, submitted by cardinals seeking clarification reinforced the perception of an intentional ambiguity. The contradiction arises from the contrast between a universal, absolute prohibition and the introduction of situational allowance. Apologists argue that Amoris Laetitia did not change doctrine, but only pastoral application, insisting that the indissolubility of marriage remains intact. Critics respond that allowing communion for those in ongoing unions effectively nullifies the prior teaching, since the Church had always taught that the discipline itself was inseparable from doctrine. Thus, the new pastoral approach creates a de facto change while avoiding a formal declaration. This use of ambiguity marks a departure from the clarity of past teaching, creating what many see as an unresolved contradiction in sacramental discipline and moral theology. 13. Religious freedom. The 13th contradiction concerns the Catholic Church's stance on religious liberty. In the 19th century, the papacy explicitly condemned the principle of religious freedom. Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors, 1864, denounced the idea that every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. It also rejected the notion that the state should allow public exercise of non-Catholic worship, calling such views false and dangerous. Pope Leo XIII reinforced this in his encyclical Libertas, teaching that liberty of worship implied the state had no duty toward God, which he considered a fundamental error. In this framework, religious freedom was treated as a modernist threat, undermining the truth of Catholicism as the one true religion. By contrast, the Second Vatican Council in Dignitatis Humanae, 1965, declared religious freedom to be a fundamental human right. It affirmed that every person must be free from coercion in matters of religious belief and practice, both privately and publicly. The document stressed that this freedom is rooted in the dignity of the human person and that no one should be forced to act against conscience or be restrained from practicing religion within just limits. Far from condemning religious liberty, Vatican II endorsed it as necessary for human flourishing and authentic faith. The contradiction is stark. 19th century teaching rejected religious freedom as a dangerous error. Vatican II embraced it as a core principle. Apologists attempt to reconcile the two by distinguishing between doctrinal principles and political context, claiming that the Church opposed a distorted, secular version of religious freedom while affirming a properly understood one. Critics argue that this explanation fails, since both sets of documents address the same issue yet reach opposite conclusions. What was once condemned as heresy is now proclaimed as truth, highlighting a profound discontinuity in the Church's approach to modern political and religious life. 14. The Latin Mass. The final contradiction concerns the language of the Catholic Mass. The Council of Trent in 1563 defended the use of Latin in the liturgy and explicitly anathematized anyone who claimed that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vulgar tongue only. Its decree was aimed squarely at Protestant reformers who demanded worship exclusively in the common language. The Council's ruling affirmed Latin as a sacred and universal language of worship, a sign of unity across Christendom, and a safeguard against doctrinal corruption. For centuries, the Latin Mass was upheld as the normative and universal liturgical form of the Roman Rite. Following the Second Vatican Council, however, the liturgical landscape was radically altered. The Novus Ordo Mass, promulgated in 1969, established the vernacular as the ordinary language of worship across the globe. The Latin Mass became a minority practice, often restricted and sometimes actively suppressed. Pope Francis's 2021 document, Traditionis Custodes, further limited access to the traditional Latin Mass, framing it as a potential source of division within the Church. In practice, the post-Vatican II liturgy has almost entirely displaced Latin, reversing centuries of uniformity. The contradiction lies in the ethos and discipline. Trent anathematized those who claimed the Mass should only be in the vernacular, treating that position as heretical. Yet modern Catholic practice has functionally adopted exactly that principle by making vernacular celebration universal and marginalizing Latin. Apologists argue that Trent's condemnation applied only to exclusivity, that the Mass must never be restricted to the vernacular alone, and that Vatican II's reforms do not technically violate this. Critics respond that the practical effect of the reforms mirrors the condemned position, since Latin has been nearly eliminated. The shift demonstrates a dramatic rupture in liturgical philosophy, from a uniform, sacred language to local accessibility, creating one of the most visible contradictions in Catholic worship. If today's exploration spoke to you, the video on your screen will deepen your understanding even further. Go watch it now.